May 1945. Germany surrenders. And overnight, the most feared air force in history simply stops existing. But here's what nobody expected. Thousands of aircraft, fighters, bombers, experimental jets that shouldn't have existed for another decade. They didn't vanish. They were still there, sitting on runways across Europe, waiting. And what happened next sparked a secret race between former allies that would reshape aviation forever. Some of these planes would fly again under foreign flags. Others would be sunk into the ocean, burned in pits, or crushed into scrap. And a handful would disappear completely, only to resurface decades later in the strangest places imaginable. Welcome back to History of World War II. Subscribe and hit the bell. This story gets darker than you expect. Picture yourself as an American soldier in the first week of May 1945. You re-advancing through northern Germany on a road you've never seen before. The sounds of battle have faded into an eerie silence. Burned-out vehicles line the ditches. Refugees move in every direction, pushing carts loaded with whatever they could carry. The air smells like smoke and diesel and something else you can't quite identify. Then you come over a low hill, and you stop cold. Spread out before you, stretching toward the horizon, is an airfield. But not an empty one. Hundreds of aircraft sit in perfect rows on the tarmac. Fighters with their propellers still. Bombers with their bomb bay doors closed. Transport planes lined up wingtip to wingtip, like they're waiting for orders that will never come. No pilots. No ground crews. No movement at all. You walk closer. Rifle ready, boots crunching on gravel. Half expecting someone to emerge from one of the hangars. Half expecting the sudden roar of an engine starting up. But there's nothing. Just wind whistling through open cockpits. Just the creak of metal cooling in the morning air. Just the strange, unsettling sight of an entire air force sitting abandoned like toys left behind by a child who got bored and walked away. This scene repeated itself across Europe in those final days of the war. At Flensburg in northern Germany, where entire fighter squadrons sat grounded on massive airfields. At Lübeck, along the Baltic coast, where damaged bombers waited in rows for repairs that would never come. At Prague in Czechoslovakia, where hangars were packed with Messerschmitts and Heinkels and strange prototypes that looked like nothing anyone had seen before. The Luftwaffe hadn't been destroyed in some final apocalyptic air battle over Berlin. There was no last stand, no glorious defeat. The mighty German Air Force had simply run out of fuel, run out of pilots, run out of orders, run out of purpose. In the war's final weeks, fuel supplies had collapsed completely. Aircraft that could still fly had nowhere to go and nothing to burn. The command structure disintegrated as senior officers surrendered, fled, or disappeared. Ground crews abandoned their posts and tried to find their way home through the chaos. Radio communications went silent. Orders stopped coming. And the aircraft just sat there, waiting for a war that was already over. As American and British forces pushed deeper into German territory, the discoveries grew more astonishing by the day. Intelligence officers who thought they understood German capabilities realized they had badly underestimated what had been happening in secret facilities across the Reich. At first, the captured aircraft were familiar types. Messerschmitt Bf-19s, the angular single-engine fighters that had formed the backbone of the Luftwaffe since before the war began. Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, the radial engine fighters that many considered the best piston-powered aircraft Germany ever produced. Junkers Ru 52 transports, those distinctive corrugated metal workhorses that had carried paratroopers to Crete and supplies to the frozen hell of Stalingrad. Heinkel He-111 bombers, now obsolete but still present in surprising numbers. These were the aircraft Allied pilots had been fighting for years. No surprises there. But then the reports started coming in from a place called Rechlin. Rechlin was the Luftwaffe's main testing center. Think of it as Germany's Area 51, hidden away in the forests of northeastern Germany. This was where the Reich's most secret aviation projects had been developed, tested, and refined away from prying eyes. When Allied investigators finally reached Rechlin and forced open the hangar doors, they found themselves staring at the future. There were jet aircraft, not experimental prototypes still on the drawing board. Operational jets. Aircraft that could fly faster than anything in the Allied arsenal. Aircraft that made the best British and American fighters look like antiques. The Messerschmitt Me 262 sat there in the darkness of those hangars. A sleek twin-engine jet with swept wings and a shark-like nose. It could reach speeds over 550 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied piston fighters. Some had been flown in combat. Some were factory fresh, never used. The Arado AR-234 was there too. The world's first operational jet bomber. An aircraft that could fly reconnaissance missions so high and so fast that nothing could intercept it. Allied commanders had known something was photographing their positions from impossible altitudes. Now they knew what. And there were stranger things still. The Heinkel He 162 Volksjäger, the people's fighter. A small jet designed to be built from wood and non-strategic materials. Meant to be flown by barely trained Hitler Youth members in a desperate last stand that never came. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet. A rocket-powered interceptor shaped like a stubby dart. Capable of climbing faster than anything else in the world, but powered by fuels so volatile they sometimes exploded on the runway. Then there were the prototypes. The projects that never reached production. The Horton Ho 229. A flying wing jet that looked like something from the next century. The Junkers Ru 287, a jet bomber with forward-swept wings. A design so radical it wouldn't be seriously attempted again for 40 years. Wind tunnel models, technical documents. Blueprints for aircraft that existed only on paper. The scope of German aviation research stunned the Allied investigators. They had known the Germans were advanced. They hadn't known how advanced. What would you do if you suddenly controlled technology years ahead of your own? The answer came fast. Within hours of Germany's surrender, a race began that would shape the next half-century of aviation history. The Americans moved first. On May 9, 1945, just one day after the official German capitulation, Colonel Harold Watson launched a secret operation with a name that told you everything about its purpose. Operation LUSTY, Luftwaffe Secret Technology. Watson's teams fanned out across Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia with a simple mission. Find the most advanced aircraft, secure any technical documents, interrogate any engineers who knew how these things worked, and get everything back to America before anyone else could claim it. They worked fast because they had to. Other hunters were in the field. At Lechfeld airfield in southern Germany, American forces secured several intact Me 262 jets, not damaged, not stripped for parts, ready to fly. At Grove airfield in Denmark, they found jet bombers and a collection of late-war prototypes that German pilots had flown there in the war's final hours. Those pilots had made a calculated decision. They would rather surrender to the Americans than face what was coming from the east. The British launched their own operation. They called it Surgeon, and the name reflected their priorities. They weren't just after aircraft. They wanted to cut out the brains that designed them. British teams from the Royal Aircraft Establishment descended on airfields at Fassburg, Schleswig, Husum, and Rechlin. They photographed everything. They cataloged every document they could find. But most importantly, they conducted detailed interrogations of surviving German personnel. Where did you work? What did you design? What problems did you solve? How did you solve them? The most valuable engineers were offered employment. Some accepted willingly, seeing opportunity in working for their former enemies. Others had little real choice. The alternative was an uncertain future in a destroyed country with no prospects. At Raw Farnborough, British test pilots began flying captured Me-262s and He-162s, pushing them to their limits, documenting every strength and weakness. And then there were the Soviets, coming from the east, wanting everything. Soviet trophy brigades swept through eastern Germany with a very different philosophy than their western counterparts. They didn't just want selected aircraft for study. They wanted entire industrial capabilities. In Saxony, Thuringia, and Silesia, Soviet teams seized complete factories. The assembly lines that had built Messerschmitts, the engine plants that had produced the Jumo and BMW jet power plants. The tooling, the jigs, the specialized machine tools, the raw materials. Everything that could be moved was loaded onto trains and shipped east toward the Soviet Union. The Avia works in Prague, where Bf 109s had been built under German occupation. The engine factories in Moravia. The component suppliers scattered across what would become the Eastern Bloc. All of it fell under Soviet control. But they took more than machines. They took minds. German engineers who had spent years perfecting jet propulsion, swept-wing aerodynamics, and rocket motors suddenly found themselves on trains heading toward facilities outside Moscow and Leningrad. Some went willingly, attracted by promises of good treatment and continued research opportunities. Others went under guard, given no real choice in the matter. At Soviet air bases, pilots and engineers examined captured Me-262s and AR-234s with intense interest. They flew them. They disassembled them. They measured every component and documented every system. Within a few years, that knowledge would appear in new Soviet designs. The MiG-9 and Yak-15, the Soviet Union's first operational jet fighters, owed significant debts to German engineering. Here's where the story takes a turn that foreshadowed everything that would follow in the Cold War. The Americans, British, and Soviets were supposed to be allies. They had just won the greatest conflict in human history together. They were supposed to be cooperating to build a peaceful new world order. The Allied Control Council had been established to coordinate the occupation of Germany, to prevent disputes, to ensure fair division of captured resources. But at airfields and factories across Germany, something very different was happening. American teams would arrive at a research facility expecting to claim whatever was inside. They would find the buildings already stripped, documents missing, key equipment gone, fresh tire tracks leading east. The Soviets had gotten there first. Other times, the situation reversed. Soviet teams would reach a factory only to discover that German personnel had flown the most valuable prototypes west in the war's final days. The aircraft they wanted were already at American bases in the occupation zone. There were angry confrontations, accusations of treaty violations, disputes over which side had legitimate claims to specific items. The cooperation that had won the war was already dissolving into the suspicion that would define the next 4 decades. Each side accused the others of bad faith. Each side believed it was only taking what it was entitled to. And each side was racing to grab as much as possible before the doors slammed shut completely. If this is changing how you see history, hit that like button. Back in America, captured aircraft began arriving at Wright Field in Ohio and Freeman Field in Indiana. The evaluation unit there had a nickname that captured their mission perfectly: Watson's Whizzers. American test pilots climbed into cockpits designed for German aviators and took these strange machines into the sky. Me-262 jets screamed down runways built for propeller aircraft. Former enemy fighters wore American markings for the first time. The test pilots documented everything. How fast could an Mi-260 climb? What happened when you pushed it past its design limits? How did it handle in a dive? What were its blind spots, its weaknesses, its dangers? Some of those pilots paid for this knowledge with their lives. German aircraft designed for German pilots didn't always behave predictably in American hands. Engine failures, control malfunctions, systems that worked differently than expected. The learning curve was steep and sometimes fatal. but the knowledge gained was invaluable. Reports from Watson's Whizzers shaped American jet development for the next decade. Designers who had never seen swept wings or axial flow jet engines suddenly had complete examples to study. They could skip years of trial and error. At R.A. Farnborough in Britain, similar programs were underway. British pilots wrung out captured aircraft, writing detailed technical assessments. The He-162 particularly interested them. Its lightweight construction, its unusual engine placement mounted above the fuselage, its potential as a basis for future trainer aircraft. In the Soviet Union, German aircraft and German engineers were put to work advancing Soviet aviation. The technology transfer happened faster there, driven by the urgency of a regime determined not to fall behind the West. German personnel played crucial roles in all of these programs. Former Luftwaffe pilots explained cockpit procedures and combat tactics. Mechanics demonstrated maintenance requirements. Engineers walked their new employers through design decisions, explaining why certain choices had been made, warning about known problems, suggesting improvements that had never been implemented. These men had built the most advanced aircraft in the world. Their knowledge was worth more than the machines themselves, and everyone knew it. By late 1945, the collection phase was winding down. The most valuable aircraft had been identified, catalogued, and shipped to research facilities in America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The engineers had been interviewed, recruited, or relocated. The intelligence harvest was nearly complete. Now came the order that still haunts aviation historians 70 years later. The Allied Control Council ruled that Germany could not retain any military aircraft whatsoever. Every German plane not specifically reserved for approved research programs was marked for destruction. No exceptions, no appeals. No preservation for historical purposes. Fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, reconnaissance aircraft, prototypes that existed in only one or two examples. Everything had to go. The reasoning seemed straightforward at the time. Germany was forbidden from having a military air force under the terms of surrender. These aircraft represented a potential threat if left intact. Any plane that could fly might fall into the wrong hands. And besides, Europe desperately needed raw materials for rebuilding. Aluminum and steel from scrapped aircraft could become construction materials, consumer goods, industrial machinery. Between 1945 and 1948, airfields across Europe transformed into graveyards. When does destruction become waste? At Grove Airfield in Denmark, work crews systematically dismantled rows of fighters that had survived the entire war intact. These weren't aircraft damaged in combat. These were machines that had sat out the war's final months, grounded by fuel shortages, maintained by ground crews with nothing else to do. Now they were being destroyed by the victors. Wings unbolted and stacked. Engines pulled and set aside for scrap. Fuselages crushed by heavy equipment and piled like aluminum corpses. In northern Germany, British teams worked through airfields, destroying intact bombers that had never dropped a bomb in anger. Aircraft that rolled off assembly lines too late to see combat. Aircraft whose only flights had been test hops and ferry missions. All of them fed into the scrap machine. Some aircraft were burned. Work crews dug open pits in the earth, dragged airframes into them, poured aviation fuel over the wreckage, and set the whole thing ablaze. The fires burned hot and black, sending columns of smoke into the sky that could be seen for miles. Local civilians watched from a distance. Some grieving for their country's lost power, others relieved that the machines of war were finally being eliminated. Other aircraft met stranger ends. Barges loaded with fuselages and wings were towed out into the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. Miles from shore, away from witnesses, the loads were pushed overboard. Aircraft that had once streaked through the sky at hundreds of miles per hour now sank slowly into the cold darkness, settling into the mud and silt of the seabed. Even some late-war jets were destroyed. Aircraft that represented the cutting edge of aviation technology, machines that would have been priceless to study, went into the scrap heap simply because no one had claimed them quickly enough. Prototypes that existed in only one or two examples shared the fate of mass-produced trainers. Historians still debate whether more could have been saved. In 1945, the concept of aviation preservation barely existed. There were no wealthy collectors buying vintage aircraft. There were no dedicated aviation museums with climate-controlled hangars and restoration workshops. The idea that these machines might have historical value beyond their military utility had occurred to most people. The priority was demilitarization. Eliminate Germany's ability to wage war. Remove the symbols of Nazi air power. Recycle the materials for peaceful purposes. Everything else was secondary. And so aircraft that would be priceless today, that collectors would pay millions for, that museums would display as centerpieces, went into the crusher or the fire or the sea. Some types were eliminated entirely. If you want to see certain German aircraft today, you simply cannot. Every single example was destroyed between 1945 and 1948. We have photographs, we have blueprints, we have technical documents, but the actual machines are gone forever. The destruction was so thorough that for decades, aviation historians assumed almost nothing had survived. Only slowly, as wrecks were discovered in remote locations and pieces surfaced in unlikely places, did the true picture emerge. A few aircraft had slipped through the net. A few had been hidden. A few had sunk into swamps or crashed in forests where no one thought to look. But these survivors were exceptions. Fragments. The vast majority of the Luftwaffe had simply ceased to exist. Decades after the war, divers began finding what the scrap crews had pushed overboard. In the cold waters of the Baltic, where low oxygen levels and stable temperatures preserve metal surprisingly well, aircraft sat largely intact on the seabed, propellers still attached to engine housings, cockpit canopies still in place, now homes for small fish. Wings still bolted to fuselages, encrusted with marine growth but recognizable. Luftwaffe markings still faintly visible under the accumulated silt of decades. These underwater wrecks became time capsules. Objects that had been thrown away as worthless were now archaeological treasures. Some were raised and restored. Others remain where they fell, visited occasionally by divers who photograph them and wonder about their stories. Stay until the end. The strangest part of this story is still coming. Not every German aircraft was destroyed. Some found second lives under foreign flags. And these stories are stranger than fiction. In Czechoslovakia, the war's end left factories filled with partially completed aircraft. Assembly lines that had built Bf 109s under German occupation now sat idle, scattered with unfinished fighters. Engines in crates, wings leaning against walls, fuselages, missing components. All the pieces were there, but nothing was complete. Czech engineers looked at this equipment and saw opportunity rather than scrap. They didn't have the resources to design new fighters from scratch. Their aviation industry was starting from zero, but they could assemble what was already there. The result was the Avia S-199. On paper, it was a Messerschmitt Bf 109 variant. In practice, it was something far more dangerous. The original German engines weren't available. So Czech engineers substituted Junkers Jumo 211 power plants, engines designed for bombers rather than fighters. The combination was disastrous. The S-199 was nose-heavy, prone to violent torque effects on takeoff, difficult to control in combat maneuvers. Pilots called it the mezek, the mule. It killed more than a few of the men who tried to fly it. But it was all Czechoslovakia had, so it entered service anyway. For a few years, these troubled aircraft equipped the Czechoslovak Air Force. They were better than nothing, barely. And then came a buyer no one expected. In May 1948, the State of Israel was declared. Within hours, 5 Arab armies invaded. Egyptian planes bombed Tel Aviv. Syrian aircraft attacked settlements in the north. The new nation was fighting for its survival. And its air force consisted of almost nothing. A handful of light aircraft, some converted civilian planes. Nothing that could fight back against modern military aircraft. Israel needed fighters desperately, but international arms embargoes blocked every legal avenue. No major power would sell combat aircraft to the new Jewish state. The situation seemed hopeless. Except Czechoslovakia was willing to deal. In a secret agreement that violated international law, Israel purchased Avia S-199 fighters. The aircraft were disassembled, packed into crates, smuggled out of the country, and shipped to Palestine by roundabout routes. At improvised Israeli airfields, mechanics who had never seen these machines worked frantically to reassemble them. On May 29, 1948, 4 S-199s took off on Israel's first combat mission. They attacked an Egyptian armored column advancing on Tel Aviv. The aircraft that had started as German designs, built in Czechoslovakia from leftover Nazi components, now defended the Jewish state against its enemies. Think about that irony. Aircraft conceived in Hitler's Germany, built using Nazi production methods, now flying in defense of Holocaust survivors. History's sense of humor is dark indeed. Meanwhile, in Spain, another chapter of the German aviation legacy was playing out on a very different timeline. Spain had been building Bf-109s under license since the late 1930s, when Franco's nationalist forces received German support during the Spanish Civil War. After the World War ended, Spanish factories continued production using local engines and materials. The Hispano-Aviation HA-1112 was essentially a Spanish Messerschmitt. The airframe was nearly identical to late-war German designs. Only the engine was different. Rolls-Royce Merlins replacing the original German power plants in later versions. These aircraft served in the Spanish Air Force into the mid-1950s, long after the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist. Long after German aviation had been eliminated by Allied decree, Spanish pilots flew training missions and patrols in machines that were fundamentally Bf-19s. Then came an unexpected third career. When filmmakers wanted to recreate World War II aerial combat for the 1969 film Battle of Britain, they faced a problem. Original German aircraft barely existed. The few surviving examples were grounded museum pieces. But Spanish HA-1112s were still flying, still maintained, still available. So those Spanish aircraft donned German markings for the cameras. They dove on Spitfires. They twisted through dogfight choreography. They crashed spectacularly for the final cut. Watch that classic film today, and the German fighters you see aren't German at all. They're Spanish. The last flying descendants of the Messerschmitt 109 design, performing decades after their war had ended. Norway-operated captured German aircraft briefly in the immediate post-war years. Bf-109s and training aircraft wore Norwegian markings until part shortages made continued operation impossible. Some of those machines survived in storage long enough for restoration programs to save them decades later. France produced its own version of the Junkers Ru-52, called the Toucan. These transports flew in French colonial service across North Africa and Indochina. Some remained operational into the 1960s. Even Lufthansa, the German airline that had operated Ru-52s before and during the war, briefly returned to them when civilian service resumed in the early 1950s. Passengers flew in aircraft virtually, identical to those that had carried paratroopers a decade earlier. In 1955, West Germany was permitted to rearm. The Federal Republic would contribute to NATO's defense against the Soviet threat. Part of that contribution would be a new air force, the Bundesluftwaffe. But when West German planners designed their new service, they didn't look backward. There was no serious consideration of reviving wartime designs. The jet age had arrived. Piston engine fighters were museum pieces now. Instead, West Germany adopted American aircraft. F-84 Thunderstreaks at first, then Canadian-built Sabres. Later, the F-104 Starfighter. A choice that would prove controversial when the type's accident rate became impossible to ignore. The old Luftwaffe was truly dead. Its aircraft destroyed. Its personnel scattered. Its traditions abandoned. What rose in its place was something entirely new, integrated into Western alliance structures. Flying foreign designs, answering to democratic civilian control. When we destroy the past, what survives in its place? So what actually remains of the Luftwaffe today? Walk through the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., in one of the hangars. You'll find a Messerschmitt Me 262, one of the jets that American forces captured in 1945, restored, preserved, displayed under careful climate control. It looks almost ready to fly. Visit the RAF Museum in London. They have a Focke-Wulf FW-190, pulled from a Norwegian lake decades after a wartime crash. You can still see water damage on parts of the fuselage, a ghost raised from the deep. The Deutsches Technikmuseum in Berlin displays an Arado AR-234, the jet bomber that once flew untouchable reconnaissance missions over Allied territory. Now it sits behind ropes, visitors peering at it through glass. A few examples of major types survive in collections around the world. 1 or 2 Bf-109s, a handful of FW-190s, rare jets that escaped the scrapper's torch. Almost all of them have been heavily restored, rebuilt from multiple wrecks, fitted with replacement components from various sources. The original untouched Luftwaffe aircraft essentially don't exist anymore. What we have are reconstructions, composites, best efforts by dedicated restorers working with whatever fragments they could find. A handful of privately owned aircraft fly at air shows. Some are genuine restorations. Others are replicas built from scratch using original blueprints. When you see a Bf-109 perform aerobatics at an air display, you're probably looking at something assembled from pieces of 3 or 4 different crashed aircraft, rebuilt over years of painstaking work. And sometimes, even now, new discoveries emerge. A wreck located in a remote Russian forest. An aircraft raised from a Norwegian fjord. Components found in a demolished building. Each discovery adds a small piece to our understanding of what once existed. What does this story mean? Perhaps it's about the strange afterlife of weapons. Machines built for destruction become objects of study, then tools for new nations, eventually museum displays and film props. Their purpose transforms completely, even as their physical form remains recognizable. Perhaps it's about the speed of historical change. In 1940, the Luftwaffe dominated European skies. By 1950, it had been eliminated so completely that most of its aircraft existed only in photographs. The runways where fighters once scrambled grew over with grass. The factories that built bombers manufactured consumer goods. Perhaps it's about what survives destruction. The aircraft were crushed and burned and sunk. But the knowledge they embodied transferred to new owners. American jets over Korea carried German insights. Soviet fighters incorporated German engineering. The technology lived on even as the machines died. Or perhaps it's simpler than any of that. Nothing lasts. Not empires. Not armies. Not even the most advanced weapons of their time. The Luftwaffe vanished so thoroughly that most people today have no idea what happened to it. Now you do. Thousands of aircraft sat abandoned across Europe in May 1945. The Allies raced to capture the most advanced examples, study their secrets, recruit the engineers who built them. Then they destroyed almost everything that remained. A few aircraft survived. In museums, in foreign air forces. In underwater graves, slowly corroding in the cold darkness. Silent witnesses to an air force that terrorized a continent for 6 years and then simply ceased to exist. The technology reshaped aviation for generations. The machines themselves are nearly gone. What remains are fragments, reconstructions, and stories like this one. If this changed how you see history, Watch what happened to German U-boats after WW2 next. Same untold story. Same hidden history. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. Thanks for watching History of World War II.